An amazing Wednesday we're having, talking to filmmakers from all over the world, Greece, Russia, Iran, England, here in the United States. And this panel is our, I think, fourth one of the day. It has been such a privilege to be able to sit and meet with some of the directors that we have here at the Center Film Festival. My name is Pearl Gluck. I am the artistic director and co-founder of the festival, and I'm the person who has the privilege to actually watch all these movies, discuss it with the programming team. These two films came in very different ways. Erin Kirkland's short film, Since You've Been Gone, My Heart Stopped Beating.
Since You Arrived, My Heart Stopped Belonging to Me.
Since You Arrived, My Heart Stopped Belonging to Me. You'd think I'd know this by now, but clearly we've been going since 10 in the morning. Such a beautiful short you'll be hearing about shortly if you haven't already seen it. And if you have, I'm sure you can't wait to talk to Erin. Please put your questions in the chat, which is either on Facebook Live or YouTube or Eventive. That film was through Film Fatale. I'm sorry, no, that film came to me through Catherine Axley, one of our programming committee members and a new person here in our film production department at Penn State. It's La Madrina that came to me through Film Fatale. I myself am part of Film Fatale. Raquel Cepeda is part of Film Fatale. And when I saw them, of course, they're incredible films. Programming committee loved it. But I've decided to put these two together into a block called Thicker Than Water, because to me, both of these films talk about blood and different ways that we define connection and family and what drives us mothers in all of its definitions to go wherever one needs to. In Erin's case, miles. And in Raquel's case, almost never leaving the Bronx, but having traveled years, and I guess in a kind of an emotional way, miles for and with so many people around her. So you're going to be hearing both of those filmmakers talking to Dara Walker, who I just met because I saw her work and her connection to a lot of the material that's raised in these films. And I couldn't think of a better person to come and have a conversation. Dara Walker is the assistant professor. She's an assistant professor of African-American Studies, History, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And her work looks at children and youth, the history of children and youth, urban history, 20th century US history, public history, and is currently writing a book called High School Rebels, Black Power, Education, and Youth Politics in the Motor City, 1966 to 1972, which may or may not be the year that I was born. But with that, it is a pleasure to introduce three incredible people here today to talk to us, Dara Walker, Raquel Cepeda, and Erin Kirkland.
Thanks so much, Pearl. I am thrilled to be here to discuss two really great films. I'm gonna go ahead and change my view here so I can see everyone. And I was telling Pearl earlier that I love both of these so much that I would love to show them in my classes. And I think, you know, whether it's a women's studies course, it's a history course, or an African-American studies course, I think that they raise such great and brilliant questions that students can wrestle with through media, right? I think through the stories of these women's lives, it makes history real in, I think, these interesting ways. And so I'm really trying to figure out, like, how do I bring this in? And it's just like, I think both just really dynamic pieces. And so I wanted to share that with the filmmakers. I want to thank them for telling these stories. And I'm super excited to just kind of dive into what I see as some key questions, some things that I wanted to think through collectively. And as Pearl mentioned, I'm someone who studies social movements, particularly through the experiences of young people. So that's kind of how I found myself thinking about the movie, which was not intentional. It was like, okay, I'm gonna go through, watch the films as they are intended to be watched. But you know, the thing about film is we take away the things that we take away from them. And so for me, it was interesting that after I finished both of them, I saw a couple of similarities. And so in both instances, the women in these films push us to consider questions around motherhood and mothering. We might say community mothers, questions around citizenship and care for children, whose children are protected, whose children have access to a notion of a childhood, whose children has access to resources and the like. But they both do so in ways that demonstrate how women use their own experiences to make demands upon the state and upon their communities. And so they're doing very complicated work here too, because these are women who are working in defense of a collective, but they show us how women are navigating complicated spaces where families or communities play a role in the issues that they're actually concerned about, right? And it gets very complicated, so I want to talk about that as well. And so the discussion I would love for us to have today are really kind of around those key questions. I have some questions that are for both of the filmmakers, and I have some questions that are specific to the films themselves. And so, of course, the first question I have, and this is to both Raquel and Erin, why did you decide to create the film that we've had the pleasure of watching?
Okay, thank you, Raquel. Thank you, Dara, and thank you, Pearl. It's such an honor to be here and to share our film with your audiences. And Dara, thank you for, am I pronouncing your name right, Dara?
It's Dara, like Sarah.
Dara, okay, thank you, Dara. And thank you so much for your insight just in that opening. I feel like so fortunate to be here. Yeah, and I'm gonna try to make my explanation as brief as I can, but it's been like, it's a project that has kind of been with me for many years. From 2012 to 2016, I lived in Guatemala, and I was working specifically in fair trade with backstrap weavers, and I had a friend there who was a single mother, and I remember asking her once about her, the father of her child, her children, and she told me that she didn't know what happened to him, that he migrated north, and she never heard back. And it was like through that story, and he had been missing for 8 years, and she didn't know where to turn because he was traveling without papers. And so there was a lot of stigma in her own community around kind of reporting it to the local authorities and not really sure where to turn, where she could go. And so that I first heard that story, I think in like 2014, and I started asking a lot of questions and doing a lot of research. And I was connected with a local organization in Guatemala City called ECAP that helps women in Guatemala specifically look for their loved ones who disappeared on the migrant trail. And it was through talking with them that they told me about this caravan that they've been doing, I think for over 18 years, every year through Mexico, where they organize delegations of Central American mothers, and they essentially travel the migrant trail looking, like demanding the protection of migrants' rights and questioning the authorities, because many times the authorities in Mexico are explicit of or implicit in the abuse of migrants' rights. And so I met with this woman, Kata from ECAP in 2016. And I was not a filmmaker at that point. I was living with a filmmaker, and it was through our conversations that I started dabbling in film. And I decided to kind of like do a total career change. And I went and I got my MFA in documentary film from Stanford. And this film has like kind of always been in the back of my mind. And then when I finished my MFA in 2018, I reached out to one of the organizers of the Caravan. And he was like, oh, we have 2 seats on the bus. We're leaving in 2 weeks. If you want to come, like meet us in Tapachula in Mexico. And so my partner is also a filmmaker. And we just put everything on my credit card and flew down to Mexico and traveled with these women for 2 weeks. And just recorded everything. We had no idea what we were doing, what the film we were making. But it was like through those 2 weeks that we just, the amount of love that these mothers have for each other, for their families, for their missing children. It was, I can't even put it into words. And so we traveled with them for 2 weeks. And then I ended up going back a year later to record testimonies. I wanted to do it in their homes in a more intimate setting. The Caravan was such like a physically and emotionally draining trip for everyone. And so by the time that it was done, there was like no kind of, everyone was just like so spent that pulling people's testimonies again just like didn't feel respectful. And so I went back a year later and recorded these testimonies, and it took us about like maybe 2 years to edit and finish the film. And we had very little support, even though we were applying for grants and everything. And so, yes, sorry, that was maybe a little bit too much information, but how this film kind of came to be.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I think that there's a question in there, if we get to it, for both of you, about like how you build relationships with the people right in front of the camera, and the ethics of that, the complexities in that. So if we get to that, we can come back to it. But thank you.
Well, I'm going to probably answer that question in my in the first question that you posed.
Okay.
Well, I met Laureen Padilla, who's a protagonist of La Madrina, through my mentor and a friend of hers named Henry Chaffan, who's also not only the executive EP, the executive producer of this film and another film that I did called Some Girls, but also a filmmaker behind the first hip hop documentary called Style Wars, which, won Sam Pollard an editing award in 1983. It's the first documentary about hip hop, and it's one of the most beautiful films I've ever seen. And it's the thing that not only made me want to make and tell those kind of stories one day, but also even my husband, who's also a filmmaker, want to tell those stories. So, Henry is a very special part of our lives. And he's been entrenched and been a part of the community fabric in the Bronx, being a graffiti historian and a filmmaker for 50 years. So in that, he made a film after Style Wars about a group of people that were in street families or gangs, depending on where you're located, coming out of that world and going into the civilian world, if you will. And in that, he made a film with a woman named, a teacher named Rita Fetcher, called Flying Cut Sleeves, that kind of became kind of a cult film. You can Google it and you'll find it on YouTube, because no matter how many times he takes it down, people put it back up. So it's fine, it's beautiful. And in that film, Laureen was, I don't know, a much, much younger person. And, and something about her kind of struck out to me, and something about her kind of like, I don't know, she reminded me of the women that raised me in my own community, because I was also someone not raised by a biological parent, but by the streets. So she basically kind of represents, she's kind of like making this film for me, and also like, talking to her and meeting her and getting to know her and actually building a relationship with her that was kind of almost instant from the time that we met. We just, she just said to me, Rocky, real recognize real, I just something about you, know what I'm saying? So just getting to know her and actually not turning on the camera for a year, but kind of getting to know her, and also, being open enough to be vulnerable with her and also tell her something about myself. She was like, well, you're part of my community, so, who better to tell the story? So, we did that in 2016, started filming 2017, and here we are. So, yeah, so part of that whole thing was community building and letting her know, like, I'm not here to just, take your story, but I'm here to document our story. And through your story, I'm kind of telling part of, a narrative on the women that raised me that I don't see on the screen, whether it's a big screen or whether it's streaming. You don't really see a lot of American Latinx stories being told in the mainstream unless they fit into a very binary box.
Wow. Thank you both. I had other questions that are for both of you, but I think just for the sake of time, I want to kind of dig into like questions specific to both of the films. And then if we have time, I'll come back to those questions. But I want to kind of start with you, Raquel. I made kind of a bit of a back and forth here. So like the historian in me is going to be very selfish with this one. And part of that is her story starts in the late 60s, right? At least her childhood, it seems like, starts in the late 1960s. Yeah. 50s, right? But she's coming of age in the 60s. And so what I'm thinking about, like, her girlhood in this moment, and what was it like for you to kind of look backwards and try to develop that story from a kind of 21st century lens?
I mean, I was lucky in that I was able to find, people in her community in the South Bronx at the time didn't have, they weren't growing up in the same neighborhoods as Joan Didion, if you will, or Gloria Steinem, where there's a lot of archival material on them, right? Or movies, or these like really cool looking, right? So archives. So, you know, she was actually part of a film named 80 Blocks from Tiffany's, which is also like a cult must watch classic about New York City that came out in 1969, I believe, and it was filmed in 68. And Joan Churchill, who's a mother of, you know, documentarian cinematographers, she actually was a cinematographer on that film. And it was directed by Gary Weiss, who was at that time working for SNL. And that film was based on 80 Blocks from Tiffany's, was based on, and I'm gonna answer your question, but I have to like locate you in my response. And basically, you know, there was an article in Esquire about Laureen's husband, Blackie at the time, her then husband, and this, you know, Savage Skulls, and also, you know, the patrol, the cops that were patrolling them, Bob Werner, if you will, you know, that was in the film. And he decided to make a short film that was supposed to be part of SNL. Back in that time, SNL was a little bit more serious. They would include those kind of shorts. It was a lot more political. It was it was really interesting back in that time. And Lorne Michael said, no, it's too serious. You know, I'll support a feature. So he made a feature, and time goes by. People have used, you know, anytime you see a film about the Bronx, you'll see footage from that film. You'll see, you know, like, and Baz Luhrmann recreated parts of that film in order to make The Get Down. For me, I didn't want to do the same old, so I went on a 2-year trip trying to find outtakes. And to make a very, very long story short, after 2 years, I did, in the most unlikely of places, find boxes and boxes of unspooled 60 millimeter film, of which I was able to take a few to see if they were still usable. Of those, many of them had nothing. They were just plain boxes. I said, that's the one that speaks to me. And I took it with me to do art with my editor. After an hour of taping it, putting it together, we started like, you know, watching it, and it was black. And then suddenly there was Laureen as a 24-year-old at home with her children. And we were screaming, people were coming in. And I was like, it's because when things are meant to be, the world conspires to help you make it happen, especially if the world and the universe can feel your passion. And I had that passion. So, you know, we were able to construct some of her stories through these archives, and also through so many other people that gave us receipts and gave us photos. And, you know, it was like a big journey in collecting the archives. But in that, I was able to not only to reconstruct her girlhood, and a lot of her girlhood I can identify with, because I had a similar trajectory. In some ways very different, divergent in other ways, but I can, because she actually doesn't even live too far from me, I understand where the space that we come from. So I'm able to get into the nuance in a way that those that know will know, and those that don't will be curious. And be able to empathize in some way.
Yeah. Wow. That is, because there's a part of me that was interested in why there was so much footage here from her doing these kind of mundane things, right? Because I think when we think about this moment, it's always about the explosive parts. It's not people living their ordinary lives, being in family, being in community, right? And I think that that's something that in many ways, Erin's piece kind of allows us to raise questions about when we talk about the immigration debate, as I'm using it, as it has been termed. But when we talk about that debate, we don't think about the toll and the cost of it, of the debate itself, and of the lack of coherent policy or the policies that we have in place. And so, Erin, can you talk more about the need for these kinds of stories? We learned about women who are navigating health illnesses, health issues, and that I don't know if one of the parts was that some of these illnesses derive from the pain that they feel of loss or exacerbated, what have you. But we don't get that mundane piece. And I don't want to call, the health issue a mundane, but it's not the visual or the propaganda that we see of like masses of people right, trying to enter a country. It's a story of women collectively together trying to make the state responsible or own up to these issues. But we're missing that part that Raquel has, right, which is the ordinary, the impact of that. I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, I think it definitely makes sense. And I will say, when these women are on this caravan through Mexico, there's like so much press. There's so much Mexican press there that are constantly asking about their stories. And I think when we were on the bus with them and we started chatting with them, we asked about their stories, but we mostly wanted to know about them and how they were doing and how they were feeling and how this impact on their life has kind of taken a toll. And I remember when we started asking these questions and doing these interviews, it was kind of, I think, surprising for them. And also when they started sharing their responses, like we talked to them about sleep and dream, like what they dream about. And there were commonalities in all of their responses. And I think in our film, I think there are scenes, and we had a couple more scenes that just because we were making a short, we had to kind of take out, but that really show like the woman taking care of each other and the woman like the slower moments that, like, I remember we were showing our cuts to people, they're like, you know, cut those out, like keep it tight, you know, like we just want to see, you know, the narrative that's kind of these women fighting against the state for immigration, but it's like in the slower moments that like the motherhood, like just like the intimacy of like being people kind of are revealed a bit more, and how these women take care of each other, and the impact that immigration has on these communities, like after people leave and after people disappear, which I think isn't spoken about enough, because, you know, people have been disappearing for, I mean, hundreds of years, but like specifically on the migrant trail in Mexico and the US-Mexico border, there is no responsibility. And I think these women are trying to like show that justice needs to be served. And I don't know if I answered your question or not.
No, you did. And I mean, immediately I thought about the moment where one of the women was like putting on foundation on one of the other women. And it was just like this moment of clarity for me about I think people think we romanticize showing one's humanity and human dignity as if it's like, oh, that's like soft, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, how do we then make sense of these women organizing themselves in what seems to be a transnational movement, right? Across these spaces, across like 15 years. It is those very intimate moments that they're missing with their loved ones. And that is a part of their humanity and their human dignity. And I think that also lends itself to, you know, Raquel's piece, which I think that this question of motherhood and mothering, I want to think of it as community mothering, because I think in both instances, these groups of women are concerned about the collective, right? They're very much concerned about the collective. And so I wanted you to, and I'm talking to Raquel here, there is, and just for this, I guess actually for the sake of time, I'll jump ahead in Laureen's life. So she's trying to navigate this very complex context of you have demands for criminal justice reform, right? And defunding the police, et cetera, et cetera. And she's trying to navigate this very real incident that happens to her grandson, which is that he ends up getting shot, I think by a stray bullet. And so one of the things that she does is and this is one of the many forms of activism that she engages in, is she tries to get the state legislature to create a piece of legislation that would have a minimum sentence for anyone who's caught with a gun near places where kids congregate. And so I'm thinking about this conundrum and like, does her story point to a different path? Because it seems like the only two options we have is defund and like that is, you know, there is much more nuance there than I think people understand, right?
Are you saying she's not talking about defunding the police and her?
No.
Before the events of last summer and before, you know, And I just want to make a note. I just want to say something before I answer that. It's very important for me, like where other people might feel like there's a mundane, if you will, a piece of film that I'm showing. I very purposefully show those pieces, because when I've seen films about quote unquote street families or gangs, however you're located, depending where you are, people are like, kind of, for me, in my opinion, playing up for the camera, playing up toxic masculinity, audiences. I've been in an audience where people are laughing when somebody said, yo, I kicked his ass, and in a more, I fucked him up, basically is what he said, because I'm a badass. I looked around the audience and I'm like, okay, the people that are laughing were not people who look like us, or people that had our experiences. They just kind of romanticize it. Not only that, almost fetishizing, black on brown, brown on black, brown on brown, black on black people, BIPOC on BIPOC violence, because it's sexy and because it's the gang days in New York City. I try to show a fullness of character. And because of that, I chose to really show what people go through after all the posturing. And in reality, a lot of the women weren't living the lives of posturing. They, on some points, were more, and there are two ways to look at it. Sometimes they were more lethal because they were quiet, and people that, are really out, to do what they need to do are quiet about it. And then also they're trying to make a way and a better future for their communities, for their children that are biological, and for the children that they're raising. They're trying to make spaces where they don't have to go through what they went through. So for me, when I watched Laureen cooking or sitting down watching TV in a building that had no electricity, that they had to, for me, that's not mundane. For me, that's like, wow, I can't believe that they found a sense of normalcy in this space. So I just wanted to make that note because of what you said before.
Yeah, and I just want to back up for a second.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to back up for a second. So when I talk about the mundane, I'm talking about the everyday.
Right.
Right. And I use mundane because I think it's the opposite in some ways of the romanticized pieces that you were just laying out.
Right. Right. So then your next question was.
Yeah. So then, and I know that she's not calling for defunding the police. I'm trying to think about that moment where she's like in so there's Sepulveda, who I think says,
yeah. He's no longer a city council. Klein is no longer a senator. Basically, I really, that's a very interesting story to me, because she says at one point when Congressman, then council member Richie Torres asked her, why don't you run for office? She said, because politicians are full of shit. If you really look at that film and then think about what happened afterward, politicians are full of shit, whether or not I personally or don't support carceral justice. She actually has moved on from that. And, even during the making of that film, she would say when we were not filming, like, I prefer to help the people that were victims of this violence and their mothers and their fathers and their siblings get help, because she sees it in her own family, how the trauma of her grandson being shot at then 3 years old really did affect the family and had ripple effects and long-term effects. So she has moved in a personal personal POV from a carceral to a restorative justice kind of model. So, I'm thinking about adding a card, because, it just didn't happen during the filming, and how long can I really film? This is meant to be a point of departure, not have like a neat beginning and a neat end. That's not life. I want to, you know what I mean? So. Yeah.
And I mean, thank you for that. And there was, I did have a question about like this conundrum, because she makes so many different shifts, but she carries different parts of the shifts along with her. And so it's not there's this moment where she says she keeps one foot in the outlaw life, and then one foot was like in the community work or in the community politics, that I was just fascinated by and wanting to know more about, like, and we see how she does it, but like the intentionality behind that decision. She's
not going to turn her back against the people that have given her community. I think that would find that suspect, she's just not going to do that. These are the people that are in her life, you know, she's in the outlaw world. And also I wanted to show that people are not binary, they're complicated, and that sometimes they can want to make a change, and they can want to create a positive a space for the communities to thrive and also be part of these spaces. I don't like one thing that I respect about her is that she talked about taking part of the arsons when she was 15 when the South Bronx was burning, but also turning around and getting her hands dirty and literally becoming part of the solution and taking part of the reconstruction of the Bronx. And she said, look, I fucked up, and it's what it is, but she's not going on an apology tour, which I find to be super disingenuous and not the way the world works. So that's what attracts me more to her as a character. She kind of inspires other people that are imperfect to try to want to also make a change. Those are the kind of characters, and those are the kind of stories that I want to tell.
Yeah. And I think, that is the complexity of her life is what also brings so many people into it. All of those different people we met, right? Just for the sake of time, I wanted Erin to kind of talk a bit about whether or not the mothers in your film had concerns about the generational impact of the policies that they're having to navigate, of the losses that you feature in your film.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, many of the women have, repeatedly said that there's like no future for young people in their countries. And yeah, it's not getting better, it's only getting worse. And yeah, I don't know what's good, like Kamala Harris going to Guatemala and telling people not to migrate isn't the solution. Yeah.
Yes. So thank you for that. So the two final questions that I have for both of you. What was the best part about the process of filming, and what was the hardest part?
The hardest part was finding archives that haven't been used to death. And the best part was using archives that are fresh, that are contributing something new to the story of New York City, my hometown, where I was born by way of Dominican Republic, and by contributing this to our culture. Anytime I get to represent New York City is a great day for me. And that to me was the most rewarding part of it, is to be able to give back and show somebody, and then how the story came out, showing somebody in their full selves and in their full dimensionality.
The historian in me loves the archival response. Erin?
Yeah, the hardest part was, I think, the edit for us. We had filmed all day, we had so much footage, and there were so many different films we could make. But I think we ultimately kind of just carved a film that was really based on the emotional journey that these mothers are on. And I think the best part, which was also the scariest part for me, was showing the film to the mothers. And I showed it to them kind of at various points, but when the film was finalized and I shared it with them, their response of how it captured kind of exactly all the emotions that kind of arise in the journey, and with the struggle of having a missing child. I don't know, that felt it felt good and validating that we helped kind of capture this experience in a way that felt true to them.
I lied, I have one final question. Okay, so is there anything that we did not discuss, or anything that you want the audience to take away from the film that we haven't addressed that you want to leave us with today?
I mean, that would take a whole hour. I would take another hour, but I would just say quickly that American Latino stories are American stories. And, we're part of the cultural narrative fabric of this society, and we should be seen more.
Erin?
Yeah, it could take a whole hour. I think the United States is responsible for the chaos that's happening in Central America. And a lot of people want to pretend that we do not have a role in the history and the current like destabilization of pretty much most countries in Central America, which isn't the fact. So I would encourage people to, learn their real history that isn't taught to us in schools about the US role, and kind of really work to learn more about solutions to the immigration crisis that are actually supportive of Central American communities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both. We can clearly have a long discussion about US empire impact in the Bronx, Venezuela, but not today. Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I can't wait to bring these films into the classroom.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, thank you. It was so wonderful to listen to this conversation. And I just kept thinking each one of you, and I mean all three of you, should be doing master classes on some of these issues and ways in which to engage the next generation and those that could really gain from the work that you're doing. I don't have any additional questions. Dara, you've asked all the film questions I was going to ask. The only thing I like to do, because it's a film festival and we discover films we may not see yet because they're not out yet, or we see films that maybe didn't appeal to the kind of the larger machine, but speak to real individual needs in our large machine, is what are you working on now? Like what's your next project, if you have one, and how can people find you and your work?
I am working on a very, very nuanced, non-binary story about a man that took a brief descent into white supremacy and finds his way out of it. And he left the world wanting to ignite it and came back repulsed by where we've come. And I'm following as he's acclimating back into society in a very non-apologetic way, which is the kind of character. He's like a character that I love for it. And it's based on an article that I edited back when I was an editor-in-chief of a magazine when those existed in 2003. So it's been on my mind for a long time. And I'm also working on, I recently finished a script. I adapted a book that I wrote about coming of age in Washington Heights and Inwood, and based on the year 1989, which is a very contentious year in New York City. And just working on that. That's all I'm doing. I know that sounded vague. Oh, you could find me by just Googling Raquel Cepeda, or CEPEDA. Yeah. And I'm around. Yeah.
And we're happy for it.
Thank you.
What about you, Erin?
Yeah, I'm in the pre-production research development stage on my first feature doc, which I am making in collaboration with a family of backstrap weavers in Guatemala. And I used to work with weavers in Guatemala and weavers in the US. And so I'm really excited to help capture a little bit of this beautiful art. But I'm really hoping to tell the story of why Indigenous communities in Guatemala are being forced to leave due to globalization, climate change, poverty, through the lens of backstrap weaving and this family of backstrap weavers. Yeah, and you can find me, again, searching my name, Erin Kirkland, or on Instagram, Erin Semine. Yeah, and I can't wait to see your film, Raquel. It sounds amazing, and I feel bad that you didn't watch it beforehand.
Likewise.
Oh, it's all right to watch it after. Plenty of people that are listening now are now going to say, wait, what? Because, it's a film festival. There's so many films and there's so much going on, especially now in our lives. And we spend so much time sitting and looking at screens. Yes. But once you press play, it's a different story. And that speaks to your both of your abilities to navigate the craft in order to draw us into the lives of the women that you're portraying and the people around them. What about you, Dara? What's next for you? I know we talked about your book.
Yeah, I mean, faculty, that's what we do. We write books. No, I mean, basically I'm on fellowship this year, writing this book on high school student organizing and political study in Detroit during the Black Power era. Besides that, you know, in the classroom, just helping students sharpen their analysis of the contemporary moment using history, and working on just making sure that the students, you know, in Central PA feel like they have community.
That's really awesome. You know, we're awarding Madeline Anderson with a Lifetime Achievement Award at this festival because she's originally from Lancaster. And so I went out to Brooklyn, where else, to interview her. And she was on the first team that put the Electric Company together, was responsible for helping diversify and do outreach. Was the first, they say the first Black female producer on WNET and so on. But she did Integration Report 1 and a number of other activist films. Anyway, I say this because in the interview, this was really interesting. She was talking about how in Lancaster, where at that time, if not to this day, everywhere, but she was talking about Lancaster in the 40s, there was incredible racism. And she was making these placards for the signs for the protests. And she was 13 and 14. And she said, someone needs to make a film about these teenagers.
Yeah.
In the exact time, I think maybe a little earlier than what you're looking at. And that's really wonderful that you're doing this book. And what I should do is introduce you to Madeline. Unfortunately, she's not going to be here in person, which is where we like to meet each other and network and connect, and brand new projects emerge from moments like this. But it's great that you're writing about that. And I think those the teen story and the fact that they were teens, I think, is overlooked sometimes. But anyway, thank you to
Dara, I just want to say one more thing to you. I wrote down something you said, in defense of a collective. I'm going to use that. I just wanting you to know that. I'm going to sample you, girl.
Oh, okay.
Sample you.
Thank
I'm going to sample you.
Thank you.
That's what I was trying to say, but in a more concise way. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, maybe something's growing already right here before our very online eyes. Wonderful. Well, it is so good to almost meet all of you. I want to thank our watching and listening audience for taking the time to hear what artists, writers, filmmakers, storytellers have to say about their work. I hope it empowers you, encourages you, inspires you. Our next live stream is in 20 minutes with Lynn Sachs, who is an autobiographical filmmaker in her own right, truly an incredible filmmaker, and in conversation with Gabby Sumney, who is also a very interesting, genre-pushing experimental filmmaker, and also just came here to Penn State to teach. So that should also hopefully be of interest. But there is something in here for everyone, even the kiddos. So do check out our lineup. Once again, Dara, Raquel, and Erin, thank you so much for your time. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dara.